The first year in the alternate history was eventful. We discussed the campaigns in Greece following the Ottoman withdrawal, the Treaty of Constantinople, and the Moravian Revolt. We also introduced the three men who would be fundamental in shaping the next few centuries in our alternate history: Constantine XI, Vetranis, and Anitius. The rest of 1454 and really the next 3 years saw a peaceful period in Constantine's reign. His treaties with the Bulgarians and Serbians had left the three parties mostly content with the division of the territories, so there was no need for pointless hostilities. The handling of the Moravian Revolt further solidified support for Constantine and the Palaiologos family with the people, who were more importantly being reincorporated into the army. Speaking of the army, instead of bottling up all of his men in one province as he had done in 1453, Constantine dispersed his men across the provinces of Greece. He assigned them to their own forts and ordered their continued training and recruitment. In 1457, the early stages of Constantine's province reorganization began to take form. He appointed Anitius to lead this ambitious project, knowing the Athenian would be more than capable of handling it, given his expertise at working with insufficient resources. This saw the organization of villages, towns, and cities along Greece fall into 5 separate themes: the Constantinian, Thessaloniki, Hellas, and Moravian themes. The Moravian themes were just the holdings of Thomas and Demetrios, by the way. For each army and each theme, Constantine appointed 2 senior commanders, who would answer to the Loukas Strategoi. The Loukas Strategoi and the governor were to have their own separate responsibilities. The only problem Constantine had now was to promote the right men for the command of these armies. He assigned Laurentius Becklus to the theme of Thessaloniki, 1, because he could be trusted, and 2, he would serve as a counterweight to Loukas Notaras and his faction. For the other themes, he could assign any other soldier to be the local strategos, but the Constantinian theme would have to go to someone he could trust, and who could be relied on to keep the loyalty of the army to the empire and emperor. Constantine offered Vetranis another chance at being in the Roman army, hoping he'd grow from his low point into a great general. After some consideration, Vetranis accepted the emperor's offer, with the request that he be made the legal guardian of the boy from Larissa. Constantine agreed and stationed Vetranis at Arcadiopolis, the home of the army's new barracks. Vetranis got acquainted with his new post and let his adopted son Gregorius explore the camp and talk to the soldiers. Throughout his time in Larissa, Vetranis was taken care of by a family of farmers. There were 8 of them: a mother, a father, 1 aunt, and 5 children. The youngest child, Gregorius, always seemed to have gotten it worse. He was bullied by his siblings who went as far as to call him a burden and a waste of life. Oftentimes Gregorius would go hungry to bed, while his siblings slept soundly, having at least eaten something prior. Vetranis could say nothing though, as the family was the only reason he had a place to stay. Though this didn't stop Vetranis from using his remaining funds to go to the town's market and buy the Larissan boys something to eat. Once Vetranis had a stable source of income and amended his relationship with the emperor, he thought of Gregorius and how much better it'd be for the young boy to be his legal son, thus his adoption. At the age of 12, Gregorius was exposed to life in a Roman military camp. He and Vetranis would run drills together and often sparred with one another, though Vetranis would often let the boy win in order to bolster his confidence. Back at the capital, Constantine received troubling news regarding the Albanians under their lord Scanderbeg. Scanderbeg had amassed an army of 13,000 and besieged the still independent but weak town of Kastoria. The town's inhabitants managed to keep a peaceful relation with its neighbors since the Ottoman withdrawal. But try what they might, the Albanians, and most of all Scanderbeg, would not forget the treatment they were subjected to under the Ottomans. Constantine tried to reason with Scanderbeg that the treaty signed with the empire in 1454 was still ongoing, and that by taking Kastoria they'd be breaking the terms of the treaty. Scanderbeg reminded Constantine that in said treaty the ownership of Kastoria was not clearly given to either side. If Constantine wanted Kastoria, he should have taken it already. Feeling strong bitterness over the loss of Kastoria, Constantine sent Demetrios to get a head start in recapturing what was once the former province of Epirus. Demetrios' army was relatively small, but being isolated from any potential relief force, most of the town surrendered without a fight. The only town that refused to do so was Ioannina, who closed their gates at the sight of the Roman army. Demetrios, unable to besiege the town with its low numbers, encamped near the city, waiting for Constantine and his reinforcements. Unfortunately for Demetrios, the army would not come in time. Scanderbeg and his army arrived a few weeks after Demetrios. They too were denied entry, but unlike Demetrios, they were able to dig in for a siege. After 3 weeks of bitter fighting between the Turkish garrison and the Albanians, Ioannina fell, forcing Demetrios to continue his march west to the Ionian Sea. His army was shadowed by Scanderbeg's cavalry. They did not engage the Romans in battle, but they did get close enough to make Demetrios' army momentarily stop and hastily go into a defensive formation, expecting a battle. When the Romans did this, the Albanian cavalry rode away, keeping their distance. This process repeated over and over again, allowing Scanderbeg and his main army to outspeed the Romans. Demetrios eventually got tired of this and ordered his archers and crossbowmen to fire warning shots at the enemy. One of the archers, however, misunderstood the order, and he hit one of the Albanians straight through the arm. Sensing he had fucked up, Demetrios marched his army back to Larissa, but were again harassed by the enemy cavalry until the Albanian army eventually caught up to him in Trikala, where both armies finally battled. Initially, the Roman army formed an encircled spear wall that protected Demetrios and the missile units, in a vain attempt to mitigate the number advantage Scanderbeg had. Demetrios ordered his men to hold for as long as they could, but hesitated to jump into the battle himself, instead letting his bodyguards join on his behalf. After a few hours of fighting, his soldiers began to grow weary and were imploring Demetrios to do something. Seeing no end in sight and refusing to die in battle, Demetrios gave himself up to the Albanians, who gladly took a member of the imperial family into custody. The first battle of the Roman-Albanian War was a complete failure for the Roman army and an utter embarrassment for Constantine XI. Having already amassed an army, Constantine marched straight for Kastoria, burning local villages and farms nearby and inciting the Turkish and Greek populations to revolt. Scanderbeg began marching his armies north and prepared his men to meet the Roman army in battle, but in the end, decided not to. He instead let Constantine continue besieging Kastoria while he sent calls for reinforcements, and engaged in hit-and-run tactics against the besieging army. The garrison in Kastoria was regularly notified that Scanderbeg would not let the city fall, and all they had to do was continue to hold the city. At night, Scanderbeg would also sneak in supplies into the city, while Constantine and his men were running low. After a year in hostile Albanian lands, the Roman army was forced to withdraw from the region, having made no significant progress in the war. Scanderbeg offered Constantine terms of truce, all of which involved a hefty price for Demetrios' release and annual tribute to keep the League of Leges happy. Constantine could never accept such a humiliating treaty, and so chose to stay at war with the Albanians. Coincidentally, it's around this time that Demetrios suddenly and mysteriously died of illness while in the custody of the Albanians. The defeat at Kastoria emboldened the former rebels of Morea, who began to openly talk of turning over the cities in the region to the Albanians. These talks of revolt were quickly stamped out by Thomas, who imprisoned those that supported Scanderbeg and the Leges League, and rewarded those who continued to show support for the Empire and the Palaiologos family. Thomas also began absorbing the former lands of Demetrios and assumed full control of Morea and its armies. The rest of 1458 was spent on rebuilding the battered army and reasserting control over the four themes. In this year, Constantine also sent Anitius on a diplomatic and covert spy mission to Nicaea. While there, Anitius had found out that Mehmed had fully subjugated the Karamanid Emirate and was preparing his army for its march east to Ak-Kayonlu lands. Though that is not what caught the emperor's attention. The war had seen an overproduction of swords, spears, and armor from both sides to the point that they were melted down for their raw materials by scavengers. Anitius managed to get a hold of one of these scavengers and organized a black market trade deal, which would see the transfer of these weapons and armor to Arcadiopolis, where they would be redistributed to the Roman army. In return, the scavengers would be paid generously. However, in order to secure this crucial trade deal, Constantine had to be at Nicaea himself, leaving administration of the empire to Thomas while he was gone. The League of Leges wasn't idle throughout this time either. They had celebrated their victory against the Romans, and Scanderbeg briefly returned to Cruje for a well-deserved break. Scanderbeg was content with the progress that was made since the Ottomans' withdrawal. In his mind, he had secured the frontier with the Romans, and furthermore, he had secured the borders of his kingdom and his people. The Ottomans were gone, the Serbians were busy squabbling with the Bulgarians. What was there to do other than rule the territory he had? This, the Venetians would answer. Venice demanded Scanderbeg to continue pushing south and take all of Morea, while Venice supported them in the war by keeping the Romans busy in Thessaloniki and Athens. At first, Scanderbeg refused, but the pressure from his nobles began to take a toll on him, who were now whispering of replacing Scanderbeg as the head of the League. Scanderbeg acquiesced and began to muster his army for one final push into southern Greece. Spies on the frontier noticed Scanderbeg's large army approaching and raced to Constantinople to warn of the invasion. When told of the news, Thomas was struck in disbelief. He lost all of his composure and shouted at the palace servants to get his couriers. He ordered all of the governors to fill up their city's food supplies and to weather any siege they may face, and that the imperial army would drive out the invaders. However, instead of reassuring the public, this only fueled their anxiety. An invading army was marching on Greece. They had to weather potential siege. Where was the imperial army? While the cities were engulfed in a panic, the local strategoi were quick to act and took control of the local governments and administration, ousting the governors and placing men of the army into positions of power. Things were starting to look very dim, until there was word of the imperial army marching to Thessaloniki, an army commanded by Vetranis and Laurentius Bekos. They planned to meet Scanderbeg at Pharsalus, but quickly abandoned that plan when word arrived from Athens that Venetian warships were landing men near the city. Once again outnumbered, Vetranis was faced with a colossal task. He convened with Laurentius about how to proceed, but Laurentius was at a loss for words. Gregorius asked Vetranis why the army didn't just fight it out like the rebels did at Morea. If the Romans fought like that and tossed aside their honor, they could repel the invaders in a matter of years. Vetranis thought about it and presented the idea to the commanders. Seeing no other option, they agreed and split the army up. Vetranis was to deal with Scanderbeg and Laurentius with the Venetians. When Constantine returned to the capital, he was bombarded with reports from all sides. He and Anitius made it back to the palace and began organizing a plan to deal with the crisis. Thomas interrupted their brainstorming session and told his brother that Vetranis and Laurentius had taken control of the situation, opting to use guerrilla tactics against the enemy rather than risking another open battle. Now that he knew how the war was going to be fought, Constantine began looking for a way to recruit more soldiers. Luckily for him, disgraced Turkish soldiers from the Ottoman Civil War offered their services to the emperor, and marched to Vetranis with the purchased weapons and armor from the black market trade deal. Initially, the Roman soldiers refused to wear the Turkish armor and use the weapons, but seeing the Turkish soldiers' success rate and low casualties during ambushes, they began to adopt their weapons and subconsciously, their ways of fighting. Constantine spent nights in the Roman camp walking around and overhearing conversations between the soldiers. He began to see the once hostile Romans and Turks open up to one another. The time Roman and Turkish soldiers spent in camp together gave Constantine the bonded army he so desperately wanted in 1453. What perplexed him now is how the Orthodox Greco-Romans were able to warm up to the Muslim Ottoman Turks over the Catholic Latins. Once again, he found himself lamenting over his failure in 1453 with the Roman and Latin debacle. To see that the Romans were getting along with the Turks far better than they did with the Latins was surprising, but at the same time, moving. He could see now that the fate of both people were intertwined, and perhaps these rivals could one day turn into the best of allies. What further solidified this notion was the news of Romans and Turks outside Thessaloniki being impaled, with the message from Scanderbeg that condemned the Romans to hell for collaborating with the mortal enemy. This act of brutality appalled and enraged the Romans in Greece and the Ottoman Turks across the Aegean, which saw a wave of Turkish soldiers take up arms and join the Roman army in its war against Scanderbeg. Taking inspiration from this, Greeks across the empire and abroad began to join the imperial armies in its war against the invaders, soaring the numbers of the Roman army. In 1459, the war would reach its climax. Scanderbeg had captured numerous towns and pillaged suspected hideouts of the Roman army. The Venetians had landed in Morea and captured the Themes army barracks, just a few miles away from Mistras. Thanks to Vetranis' plan, the Venetians spent their time in Morea being ambushed and constantly looking over their shoulders, easily succumbing to fatigue while the Romans and Turks slept soundly in their hideouts across the Erymanthos Mountains. While Thomas and Laurentius were weathering out the invasion soundly, the same could not be said for the army in northern Greece. Constantine and Vetranis were continuously on the run from Scanderbeg's cavalry, who just so happened to know when the Roman army would go on the move. Despite the Romans' harassment of the Albanian army, Scanderbeg and his senior staff had mapped out a rough map of Greece, and had all known locations where the Roman army was likely to attack marked off. The Albanians had also infiltrated Constantine's army with spies, resulting in a dilemma for Constantine. He could not trust his officers nor his close staff with his battle plans, as it posed the risk of having said plans being found out. But he also couldn't be idle. as he and Vetranis' harassment of the Albanian army was what kept the Roman army fighting. A ceasefire now would mean that all life lost in the war thus far was pointless. It was at this very moment that Constantine broke. He realized that he had gone against his own word. "We need people like you, Vetranis, men that won't throw away the lives of their soldiers in search of glory." Those words he had said echoed in his mind. Had he really let the war spiral out of control just because he didn't want to admit defeat? He thought to himself, how could he be so hypocritical? In this moment of sorrow, someone snuck into the emperor's tent while his guards took a break. This person was Gregorius, who was staring at Constantine, observing him. Constantine only realized that someone was in his tent when he felt an abnormality in the wind, as if something was obstructing the tent's opening. He immediately turned and saw the boy from Larissa looking down on him, and asked how he got into the tent. Ignoring his question, Gregorius said that they should do what Mehmed II did in his war with the Caramanids. Constantine looked puzzled, and thought about it. "You mean the fake illness?" Constantine paused and thought to himself. He recounted hearing from his spies that Mehmed was facing trouble in drawing out the Karamanid Sultan to open battle, so he faked an illness and a ceremony that would have seen the command of the army passed down to his Grand Vizier Zaganos. He turned to Gregorius and asked, "How are you so certain that it would even work?" Gregorius replied that Ibrahim II was so caught up in dealing a killing blow to Mehmed's army that he ignored all logic and let his bloodlust control him, resulting in Mehmed's ambush of the Karamanid army and a victory for the conquering sultan. He wasn't sure if this plan would even work, but there was no good alternative. So it was on that January of 1460 that Constantine Palaiologos sent an open letter to Vetranis, stating that he was deathly ill, and that the command of the army was going to be handed over to him and Thomas. He provided details of the exact location of the ceremony, and claimed that only 500 officers of the Roman army were allowed to attend. Scanderbeg's spies eventually heard of this and began planning an ambush for the officers of the Roman army and its most important figureheads. The Albanian cavalry briefly scouted the area before the main army arrived, and found that it was indeed true, except they only saw what the Romans wanted them to see. Hidden by forests, the Roman army quickly got into position and waited for the arrival of the Albanian army, headed by Scanderbeg himself. It was a crisp morning. The emperor of the Romans convened with the senior staff. In their reports they mentioned that the Roman army numbered a mere 14,000 to Scanderbeg's 23,000, including the Venetians. Constantine had all staff and soldiers engage in a prayer. The prayer was a hybridization of both Muslim and Christian beliefs, and both groups ate their breakfast together solemnly. They wished each other luck and got into battle formation. Constantine delegated control of the cavalry to Vetranis and Thomas, while he and Laurentius Bekos took control of the infantry. The archers stood in neat, organized compact rows of 5, right behind the infantry, but elevated by the terrain. Behind the archers, even higher on the plain, were the artillerymen. They were equipped with small cannons and a variation of the hakovnice, a type of firearm used in the Hussite Wars. Constantine was gambling everything on this battle, so he was prepared to do whatever it took, though not to win for the sake of prestige, but to win for those who had perished and for their families. The battle began with the Albanian archers stepping forward and firing their arrows towards the Roman front lines. The Romans, in response to this, shielded themselves and let their archers deal with the enemy. The first 30 minutes of the battle can be summed up to an exchange of arrow fire, with neither side wanting to recklessly charge into the other. After another half an hour or so, the Venetians charged into the enemy's front lines. They were well armored, so the arrow fire barely affected them, letting them fight the Roman army head-on. As the Albanian cavalry began to look for weak points in the Roman army's formation, they were caught off guard by Vetranis, who led a cavalry charge against the ill-prepared enemy. This caused the Albanian cavalry to leave the battlefield, as Vetranis pursued them. The front lines meticulously mowed each other down, with neither side gaining the advantage. Scanderbeg was convinced he could break the Roman army, so he ordered his archers to redirect their arrow fire to the enemy infantry that was dealing with the Venetians. He then sent a detachment of 3,000 soldiers to look for weak points since Vetranis' cavalry was gone. He then sent another 1,000 soldiers to go reinforce the Venetians. As the Albanian reinforcements approached, a volley of cannon fire was unleashed, severely disrupting the pace of the Venetian fighters, as they turned to see if their reinforcements were okay or wiped out. The Roman front line took this opportunity to break away and began to cut down their Venetian foe mercilessly. They would have continued to do so if it weren't for the sight of 5,000 soldiers charging at them, screaming profanities of what they'd do to them after the battle was over. The Romans were struck in a trance of fear, and even Laurentius Becus could do nothing to get the attention of the men. Constantine rode his horse and began to take charge of the situation, ordering all of his 10,000 infantry to form a spear wall, and to not give the enemy any ground. He then ordered his Hakovnice men to begin firing, and not to stop, while the archers were told to hold their fire until given the command. Constantine then rode into the view of the men in the front line, screaming at them to get back into position. Seeing their emperor right in front of their eyes, in front of the oncoming enemy, cast them out of their trance, and they began to run back to the elevated plain. As the 5,000 Albanians charged, they were joined by the Venetians, who had temporarily disengaged and reorganized. This bolstered the charging enemies to 7,000 men. Seeing this as the moment he had been waiting for, Scanderbeg ordered the remaining men he had to march to their comrades' aid. The Roman infantry braced themselves for what was looking to be their last stand. They turned to their Turkish brother-in-arms, wishing them luck in the coming fighting. Fighting valiantly, with wave after wave of Albanians withering the Roman lines, blood began to litter the ground and mask the bodies of those who had fallen. The smell was putrid and both sides began to waver. Though it was only 5 p.m., the sun had already set, and the fighting still had not concluded. Vetranis was nowhere to be found and Thomas had gone missing, along with the remaining horsemen. Things were looking grim for the Roman army. Amidst the chaos, Constantine had enough and tore off his imperial cloak, and with Laurentius Becus at his side, charged at the enemy. The Roman and Turkish soldiers looked on in disbelief. This was the man that was leading them, and they were not going to let such a man die. Both sides threw themselves at each other. The Romans and Turks in an attempt to keep their emperor and general alive, while the Albanians in an attempt to kill the Roman emperor. As Constantine and Laurentius hacked away at any man they saw, they heard a commotion from behind enemy lines. Then they saw the enemy make way for a man on a horse. The man angled his spear and pierced Laurentius straight through the shoulder, leaving him to be killed off by one of his subordinates. He then turned his horse to face Constantine himself. Scanderbeg once again angled his spear and commenced his final charge. Constantine braced himself, sword in hand, but their duel was cut short when a stray bullet from a Hakovnice struck Scanderbeg's leg and horse, resulting in the injured Albanian lord being dragged off by his bodyguards. Seeing their leader escorted from the battle, injured, the Albanian army broke, and Constantine screamed at his men to chase them down. Though weary and fatigued, the anger in Constantine's voice compelled him to do so, turning the tide of the battle into the favor of the Romans. At this time, Vetranis and Thomas reappeared, covered in scars and mowed down whatever remained of the enemy. They then stormed Scanderbeg's camp and looted it for all of its possessions. All the while, Scanderbeg watched from an isolated forest with his dozen bodyguards. There was now nothing to do but go home and rebuild his now battered army. On his way back home, Scanderbeg looked over to the horizon of the Roman border and scoffed. So long as they don't bring war to us, we won't to them. At least for now. Back on the battlefield, Constantine fell to his knees. He began to sob and thanked God for even allowing this victory to be bestowed onto him. He swore to continue to fight for those who remained, vowing to never again make the mistake of blindly going to war. He grabbed a clump of dirt and watched it fall to the ground as he let go of it, making sure what he was feeling and seeing was indeed real. He was then approached by Thomas and Vetranis, who then congratulated him for leading the men to victory. Constantine didn't turn to look at them, more focused on the ground than anything else. Thank you. Why don't you go celebrate with the others? I'll join you two in a bit. Thomas did just that and left Vetranis behind. Vetranis looked at Constantine and sat down right beside him. He patted Constantine on the back and said, "If it were any other man leading the battle today, defeat would have been certain. You're as good as it gets." Both men chuckled. "Come join us. The soldiers want to see their victorious emperor at their side." He glanced at Vetranis. Vetranis stuck his hand out for Constantine, the same way he had done so for Vetranis a few years back. He grabbed onto it and embraced Vetranis, hugging him with one arm while he held onto his side, wincing from the bruise given to him by an enemy soldier. They both staggered back to their camp and were met with cheers. They ate and joked around together the entire night, some getting too drunk to even go into their tents for sleep and passing out on the campgrounds. Constantine took it upon himself to be among the night watch. He talked with the soldiers and asked them about where Laurentius Bekos was. He was told that Laurentius was wounded but in stable condition, though they had to wait it out and see if his wound got infected. Constantine exhaled a sigh of relief and thanked the soldier, spending the rest of the night surveying the battlefield. Constantine gave the army a week's rest, and in that time he'd send out letters to his administrators, governors, and foreign monarchs detailing the victory of the Roman army and the defeat of Scanderbeg. To Scanderbeg he sent a letter requesting a truce, a request that was finally accepted. The Roman-Albanian War of 1457 through 1460 was a pointless war, one that needlessly took the lives of everyone involved. Back at the imperial capital, Constantine held a funeral for Demetrios and those lost in the war, burdened with the immense guilt for having brought this upon his own people. But he did not let grief consume him. In time, he began to move on and grow older, becoming a wise and respected emperor. He drafted laws that would see both Christians and Muslims be given equal opportunities in government, despite the protests of some of his nobles. Using whatever imperial funds he had, he constructed new roads that led directly to the thematic capitals and gave back to the impoverished towns, moved by the stories of people like Gregorius. He also led the reconstruction of his battered empire, being seen more and more by the common people than he was by the nobility. This helped immortalize the man among the people as one of the greats, a title that had been long out of use, only because, in their minds, none were deserving of that title. In his memoirs, he'd write that his people's adoration for him and his family only served to prove and reinforce his belief in them. They trusted him, and he trusted them. Should God allow him, he'd give the Roman Empire a new image and a new identity. No longer would they, the Romans, be identified by their legacy of conquest. Instead, they'd be defined by their diplomacy, ideals, and innovations. This was the new Rome Constantine Palaiologos, his descendants, and loyal followers would strive to achieve from then on. The dream of a better future, of a better Rome. In 1465, Anitius and Vetranis led a delegation to Edirne, where they discussed the possibility of the city's reincorporation to the Roman Empire. Both sides debated the issue and eventually settled on a plan that would see the city open its gates to the Roman army, so long as the nobility were to retain their status and positions. All that was needed now was the approval of the Basilius. Constantine sent a letter agreeing to those terms, and it was then that Edirne, now Adrianople, was recaptured. To celebrate this achievement of having recaptured a lost city without costing the life of a single Roman soldier, Constantine held a banquet at the imperial palace, inviting prominent men and women of the empire. During this banquet, Constantine couldn't help but feel so proud. He told them he was honored to host his guests that night, and even more so because of what they had accomplished together. He made a toast for their achievements, and in return, the guests made a toast for their emperor, exclaiming that the Palaiologos family was only getting started in the great awakening of a new Roman spirit. They raised their glass and together they drank. From afar, Ekaterine watched them musingly. In her hands was the emperor's one and only son, named Elinos, after his mother's name, Helena. Ekaterine sang gently to Elinos and walked out of the room, not one to talk and make conversation with others. At the end of the banquet, Constantine individually met with his guests and discussed the future moving forward. Loukas Notaras asked the emperor to give him governorship of Adrianople. Constantine was inclined to agree at first, but Notaras added that he wanted Laurentius Bekos to stay in Thessaloniki. He wanted the whole city and province to himself. No, that's final. But sir, I have done everything you have asked of me. I even gave those That alone should tell you why I won't give you the governorship. You blindly hate those same people who are integral to our survival. They are people too, Lord Loukas. My lord, I misspoke. Don't even mention the financial irregularities of you and your men. I know how much money your province makes and how much you are giving me. And then you come in here and ask me to give you a city that you had no role in getting back. There will be no further discussion. Leave my palace at once. Loukas Notaras left Constantinople in shame and returned to his province, where he was met by a team of advisors who were tasked with helping him administer the province, in an effort to reduce corruption in the city. Laurentius Becos was also assigned to keep a watchful eye on Notaras and resume his duties as a strategos of the theme. But while Notaras left the capital in shame, Vetranis would leave in high spirits and be tasked with the great responsibility by Constantine himself. Constantine knew he was reaching the final years of his life. Odds were that he wouldn't be able to raise and see his son grow up. So he asked Vetranis to accept the position as regent of Venice. Feeling honored to have even been considered for the role, Vetranis accepted, but asked, "Why not Thomas?" The Basilius crossed his arms and replied bluntly, "Thomas did not see things the same way as we do. I've spent the last 7 years laying the groundwork for a lifetime of peace. I want the children born today to know nothing of the horrors of war, nor how it feels like to lose a parent, or both, or, God forbid, an entire family. I want the grandsons of their children to grow up and see the beauty of living in peace, something no one else but you and I understand. I know I can trust you in making this dream a reality, hence me choosing you, of all people, to raise my son. Am I wrong in my choice?" "No, Basilius. Thank you, again." Seeing as to how you and Anitius handled the delegation at Ederne, I was thinking, could you two do the same for Nicaea? I've already laid out the key points for terms. All you and Anitius have to do is show up and read them out. Obviously add your own spin to it, should it be necessary. I'll do what I can. I'll write to you when I get to Nicaea. Good luck, Vetranis. Good luck. The year was now 1468. At this point, news of the regency was out and about, and the people were ecstatic to know that Constantine had a son, and that Vetranis was to be acting emperor until Ilinos came of age, should anything happen to Constantine. Constantine held a committee in Adrianople and proposed the creation of a permanent council that would see different members of the council take on certain responsibilities. The committee members agreed, and all that was needed was Anitius and Vetranis' approval, as they too were considered part of the committee. After an exchange of letters, the proposal was ratified, and the council would meet for the first time next May. On his way back to Constantinople, Constantine admired the beauty of the landscapes he passed. It brought him back to his first year as the despot of Morea. He remembered the feeling of hope in his heart, a feeling that had never truly left him despite his trials and tribulations. He felt as if he were in heaven. He was awakened by his retinue and his imperial bodyguards, who were stationed at the gates of the palace. He walked up to the main entrance of the palace, but stopped in his tracks. Instead of going back to his room and retiring for the day, he chose to go to the city and congregate with the masses. Seeing their emperor walk around like any ordinary man, they began to follow him, asking questions and asking for favors. Instead of shooing them away, he heard them out, offered advice, and even donated some of his personal funds to a local infirmary that was at risk of shutting down. He invited those who were surrounding him to watch a play, to which they agreed. As the people sat down and the sun set, the play began. Constantine watched the actors in admiration. He was never much of an arts-oriented guy, but he could see the appeal. He watched as the actors lit a torch and pretended they were sneaking in a dark forest. Soon, around 5 men dressed in crude replicas of knight armor sprung out from the background props. They offered to guide the 2 main actors to safety, as the forest was home to a dangerous monster and ghost of the damned. They were hesitant, but were persuaded to do so when they heard a low rumble, coming from the supposed monster. The monster began to chase the actors and the knights, but one of them stopped and lit a holy firework that was supposedly the monster's weakness. As the fireworks went off, the people watched in amazement. The sheer brightness and intensity from the fireworks left him wondering how much of the world he was missing, for he heard of stories of these fireworks being widespread in the distant lands of the east. He then saw 3 more fireworks go off, finding the reactions of the people to be heartwarming. The citizens of Constantinople were smiling, laughing, joking around with one another, and families sat together, a sight to behold for the emperor, The older people in the crowd were likely to have been there to witness the horrors of siege warfare in 1453, and were probably terrified for the safety of their relatives in those trying times. To see those same people bask in his achievements made him happy. He felt content and at peace. Before he could even respond to the first shot, Constantine was pierced by another arrow, this time to his abdomen. As he fell to the floor, yet another arrow pierced him, this time on his shoulder. It was clear to him that multiple assassins were trying to kill him. He tried to get on his feet, but he sprained his ankle and collapsed onto the floor, drenched in his own blood. The people around him screamed, some ran while others tried to tend to his wound, but it was no use. Constantine bled out and died from his wounds. Word of the emperor's death spread like wildfire in the city, and soon it reached his bodyguards. The bodyguard corps split up. One would go to the city where Constantine was said to have died, while the other went for the imperial palace. Though Constantine was dead, there was still the empress and those residing in the palace that needed to be protected, including Ekaterine and Elinos. However, by that time it was too late. When the bodyguards made it inside the palace, they found the furniture turned over, and bodies littering the floor. They managed to barge into the emperor's bedroom, and found Ekaterine lying in a pool of her own blood, but Elinos was nowhere in sight. The guards searched the room and eventually noticed that the window was open. On the ground hidden by the bushes was Elinos, who was safe and sound, though asleep. They grabbed Elinos' basket and checked to see if the baby was okay. One of the guardsmen gently nudged Elinos' face, but he didn't respond. Concerned, the guardsman tickled him, and to their relief, Elinos woke up, giggling. One of the guards who was watching this happen asked how the hell Elinos didn't wake up from all the noise. A fair question, but they then determined that Ekaterine had simply lowered Elinos' basket before the assassins barged into the room. After that, Ekaterine, wanting to avoid waking her son up, accepted the fact that she was going to die, and let the assassins kill her, using all of her strength to conceal her groan. The mere thought of the Empress willingly giving up her own life made them shiver. For they were too late. Or so they thought to themselves. But no. In reality, they had failed in their jobs as bodyguards to the Emperor and to his family. Had they been at their post, none of this would have occurred. They took a look at Elinos again and saw that the baby was unaware of what had just happened to his mother and his father. He played with the finger of the bodyguard who held him. He would never get to see the loving gaze and feel the affection a mother bestows onto her child, nor be educated and cared for by his father. The thought of this broke the guardsman who handed over Elinos' basket to one of his comrades. The guard now holding the basket, a man named Alexius, looked into the baby's eyes. And there they saw the eyes of an honorable, ambitious, and hopeful man. There was no denying that this child was the son of the one and only Konstantinos Dragatzis Palaiologos. The man who had saved Constantinople from the siege of 1453 watched over his people and guaranteed his empire's security through diplomatic means following the Roman-Albanian War. This is how his story ends. Like many before and many after, the greed and disdain of one will take the life of another. Like Romulus, like Remus.